Thank you. Hello, everyone. Once again, thank you for joining us at this webinar. Today, we'll be discussing the foundations of workplace democracy, specifically how to have an effective worker co-op board. And as you'll see in this presentation, a lot of the topics we'll be covering will be applicable to any leadership you have in your organization, depending on how you've incorporated your cooperative. You may not have a board officially, but these will be tips and skills you can take back to your co-op to strengthen the steering committee or to strengthen the general circle or to strengthen whomever is taking the role of working on the board's work, which is the strategic plan. And joining me today in this conversation is Matt and Denise, and I'll introduce myself and then I'll ask them both to do the same. So my name is Maureen Dardes. I live in New Mexico. I work in the Co-op Clinic, which is putting on today's webinar. And we're here on behalf of the U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives, and I'm glad you could join. Matt?
My name is Matt Feinstein. I use he, him pronouns. I am in central Massachusetts on Nipmuc land, and I work on technical assistance. Okay, pass to Denise.
Hi, everyone. My name is Denise Hernandez. I work at Cooperative Home Care Associates, and I am a current Federation board member. And my pronouns is she and her, and I'm happy to be with everyone here today.
Thank you both. Thanks for joining us, Denise. Before we move on, I did want to thank our sponsor. We have received funding from .coop. If you've ever been to our website, you may have noticed it's usworker.coop, provided by that organization. They have a mission to unite and empower cooperatives online, and that drives everything they do. And since 2001, Cooperation, has united the cooperative community through a shared online identity, that .coop ending, and a platform where cooperative organizations can participate, inform, educate, and pioneer a path for others to join and support the cooperative movement. So if you want to learn more about them, their website is identity.coop. Thanks, Matt. You can advance the slide. So today, like we said in the opening, we'll be discussing effective worker co-op boards. I'm going to give some context of what the U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives and the Co-op Clinic where Matt and I work provide for technical assistance and training. We'll review some really key examples and things to look out for if you're in the stage of developing your board, if you're going through a transition in your board, or if you're noticing that your board isn't meeting all of the goals that the members had hoped they would. And then we're going to interview Denise, who's graciously agreed to be here today as a board member, not only of the Federation, but an exemplary leader in her co-op. And then at the end, we're going to hold space for questions. And if anything doesn't get addressed, I'll share our contact information and you can always follow up with us. Next slide, please. So I'm assuming if you found this webinar, you found our website, but in case this information is new to you, the U.S. Federation of Worker Co-ops is the only national grassroots membership organization for worker cooperatives in the U.S. And we build the cooperative movement through providing technical assistance and training and a whole host of other resources to make sure that our community has stable and empowering jobs by being worker owners. And we have cooperative education like these webinars. We participate in advocacy, which I'll be sharing resources for at the end, and we support cooperative development. The Co-op Clinic specifically, where Matt and I work, is a place that provides peer-to-peer training. Matt and I coordinate a host of peer advisors who are worker owners themselves, who provide high-quality technical assistance and high-quality training based in their lived experience of being in a worker co-op and having experienced the range of cooperatives that they've served as an advisor. So they bring to the project support, templates, and empathy, honestly, from having walked the walk. And if you do become a member of the U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives, you receive an hour of free technical assistance per year. And we have reduced rates across our programming to make sure that we're able to provide technical assistance and training to those who need it most. And we're able to subsidize that training So if you're interested in meeting with us, you can see our website is usworker.coop/clinic, and you can request support. And now we can jump into the meat of why you're all here. And I was hoping that once we begin, if you'd like to introduce yourself in the chat and say your name and where you're from, the co-op that you're representing today, and where you're at with developing your board. Do you have a board? Are you a startup that's looking to form a board? Do you have a board that isn't serving you? Are you on the board and you're confused about what you're doing there? Let us know. And while you're sharing in the chat, I'm going to explain some context for the role of a board. I wanted to make this a little shinier, so I put this tomato plant to show that the cooperative members are the roots of any board. In some instances, the board and the members are the same. But when you look at that line dividing what's above and below ground, you can think that when a cooperative member, if they're on their own board, enters that above ground space, it's the space for growing ideas. It's the space for guiding the strategic direction of the co-op. And when they go back in the ground as a co-op member, they're doing the hard work of building the foundation of the co-op and keeping it alive, but getting it the resources it needs and providing the services or the products that the co-op is famous for. So when we think about boards, I do want to say that the board's primary focus is the long-term sustainability, the mission, and the strategy. But like I said earlier, not every cooperative has a board specifically. It's a legal thing. And a lot of what we're addressing here today is relevant to steering committees or other structures that don't use official boards. So don't hang up if you don't have a board. You're not in the wrong webinar. You still need to think about your strategy. And I'll go through these points and then I'll pass the mic to Matt to go into some further detail about how you approach the strategy. So as you can see at the base of the tomato, the primary place that boards should come from is representing the members' needs and desires. It's not up to the board to determine what the co-op needs, it's up to the members themselves. And then the board takes those needs and desires and figures out how to be generative in creating ideas for how to govern and policy for how to function in the long term. So that means you're using your critical thinking, you're creating opportunities, you're trying to identify the underlying issues that are blocking or that are helping with your cooperative to develop a successful strategy to stay in business and to stay in cooperative relationship. And once you've done that, you can focus on effectively supporting and overseeing the management. And we'll get into that relationship a little deeper later. And I did want to say, if you haven't developed a board in your co-op, but you're familiar with the boards of, say, nonprofits, a board of a cooperative is similar. The addition is that it's made up of a majority member owners. And while boards of corporations, for example, would be accountable to the shareholders, in the worker co-op, the board is accountable to the worker owners. And I just want to thank the people in the chat who are introducing themselves. I see there's Izzy from O1 Labs. You have a board and you're in the process of figuring out how to make it more effective. You have excellent taste in webinars, Izzy. Micah's from Boyfriend Co-op. They're a startup and still need to form our board. We'll get to that too. And hi, Michelle from the head of co-op development at Thou Fine Art Services, which switched to being worker-owned in 2021 after 50 years in business. I love when businesses convert and we help support that too. And it's nice to see the drivers co-op out here. Hi, Trish. And in case you're wondering why I'm reading the chat, we do count on language justice today. And so it helps folks who are joining us in Spanish know what y'all are saying. And it's nice to celebrate how many people are building successful cooperatives and want to build successful boards. I see Anne from San Diego on the board of a nonprofit, but we'll be hiring first staff soon and operating non-hierarchically. Good luck. And with that, I'm going to pass the mic to Matt. Thank you.
Great. So let's dive in more into the structures of worker cooperative boards. One common format is laid out here in this graphic, where, as Maureen mentioned, worker co-ops are usually majority owned. The board is made up of a majority of worker owners. if not entirely by worker owners. And in that regard, it's tempting to mix the operations, right? What is happening on the shop floor with the governance and the policy and the long-term components that should be happening at a board meeting. So if there's, one jewel that we can leave with you is getting clear on what is board's responsibilities and how to separate that and really go deep as a board on strategy and policy and long-term financial health and those kind of things that the board should be holding, and let the managers and the people on the shop floor do their job on the operations side, right? And then know what should be brought to all the members. So if you're a board that is made up, of a representation of the members, say you're a larger co-op and you're an elected board from a larger membership group, then there's that additional component of accountability to the broader membership. So in that, if that's the structure, then the members are really holding the, some major issues around identity, values, right? Policies that affect them directly as members, hiring and firing policies, things that affect them directly as members, changes in profit sharing policies, bylaw changes often have to go to the full membership, right? And election of the board of directors. And then final decisions such as sale or closure of business, those are often member decisions. Then the board, like I mentioned, is holding policy, right? The overall annual budget kind of decisions, strategic direction, improving the cooperative in an industry strategy standpoint, right? Holding major decisions that impact long-term policy components. The board is going to be ushering all of that forward, right? Making annual decisions on dividends and profit sharing, what's retained in the co-op for the financial health of the co-op, what's paid out. And then, like I mentioned, it's really important to allow managers and shop floor leaders to lead the day-to-day operations, right? To be leaders of the hiring and firing process. If there's a membership process in addition, that may engage other bodies, but around the product mix, new services, pricing, marketing, sales, really, and so separate out. If you're a co-op where all the members are also board members, do your best to not mix up those meetings, right? To have separate meetings that are around governance and board issues. Or if you must have them in the same meeting, have very clear separate agendas. And governance and policy type agenda items often need advance notice and proposals and some preparation, right? So it's important to have some of those things separated out for the board to look at and be prepared to go into. When those get mixed up, there can be this kind of situation of, oh, I thought we were talking about, tomorrow's marketing plan, and then now we're suddenly talking about a bylaw change, and it can feel unfair if someone, wasn't able to make the meeting but didn't know a major decision was being made. Those kind of things can come up commonly if things are mixed up, and then people can be more effective in governing if they have proposals ahead of time, if they have agenda items announced ahead of time and things like that, and can be prepared for the strategic or policy type decisions that happen at the board level. And I want to mention, if there's questions relevant to what I'm saying, feel free to put those in the chat. We can address them as I go along. If it's a broader question, we may save it to the end. And so along with this kind of who decides what that you might be figuring out in your board or solidifying or improving, it's also important to think about cycles of representation and accountability in worker cooperatives, right? As Maureen mentioned, in for-profit C corporations, companies, traditional corporations, the board is representing the interests of the shareholders, right? And that is their focus, profit, return on what the, has been laid out by the shareholders, and that's who they're responsible to. In a cooperative, you're balancing the interests of individual members that you're representing and the success of the co-op in general, right? And that balance of those interests is an additional and challenging responsibility of a co-op board member. And because you're taking into account the mission, the values, the long-term sustainability of the co-op, alongside what co-op members deserve in terms of profit sharing and interests in changing, and overseeing managers and how they're relating to the member owners, and all of those interests may be competing at sometimes, but it is important as a board member that you're wearing both of those hats and thinking about both of those components. But you are accountable to the members, right? You're not in a nonprofit board, you're accountable to a broader stakeholder group, to the public and often, or to a broader set of, charitable goals or something. But in a cooperative, you can be very focused on what is best for the membership. And so there is this kind of system of accountability that's similar to the previous graphic, where members, elect the board. So there's accountability, to the membership, and there should be regular membership surveys that engage membership, right? And ask things like, are you satisfied with how the board is operating? Are you satisfied with how the board is overseeing management? What should be changed in the cooperative on the strategic level? Those kind of things. And those can happen at annual meetings as well, or written surveys. And then the board is overseeing management, and management is accountable to the board, but should also be, have clear job descriptions and annual plans and reviews, and the board should be supportive of management in that way. And then again, there's a cycle of the management that's overseeing members to do their job on the shop floor. So it's kind of a cyclical thing in worker cooperatives that's pretty unique. So to dive into a little bit more of where does this decision lie, right? We did that first graphic of, is this a membership decision, a board decision, and laid out some general categories. But there's also this useful test that you can use to determine if a specific decision or matter that's coming before a decision-making body is one for the board or general membership or management, right? So this one is actually specifically between management or board. Is this a management decision or a board decision? And you want to ask these questions to figure that out, right? Is this a new policy or a substantial change to a policy? So again, board is dealing with the long-term policy stuff, right? So, and could this affect a large number of co-op members? The next question you might want to ask is, does it commit a substantial portion of the financial or other types of resources of the organization? Is this going to be a major shift that shifts our resource allocation? And then third, does it affect our co-op's operation, personnel, resources over a long period of time, right? There's this, will it impact us deeply right now, or will this impact us in a long period of time? And if any of those are yes, it's likely to be a board decision. Management can still be involved in shaping a proposal, but it should be ultimately a board decision. So this is called the extensiveness test. And there's a whole guide, we'll share the link later on. There's a whole guide that ICA group did on these tests that are useful to look into. The next test you might want to think about is the significance test, right? Is this a board decision, or is this a board decision that members should be deeply consulted around? And these are the questions you should ask if you want to employ this test. Does this matter affect the likely survival of the co-op, right? Is this a make or break issue around survival? Does this matter have to do with policies of hiring or terminating co-op members, right? Is this going to impact the actual membership and impact the hiring or firing? And then does the matter affect basic character of the co-op? Is this changing our values? Is this changing our major direction and underpinnings? If yes to any of these, then the board should consult membership. So this helps as a guide, right? Because sometimes there are those questions like, is this really policy or not? Well, you can ask these questions and figure out where it lies. So again, if there's any questions or if you want me to go deeper on any of this, I'm happy to. So then, what are the different roles in a cooperative board? If you, as Maureen mentioned briefly, if you're a cooperative corporation, a C corporation, a nonprofit corporation, you are required to have a board in most states, right? And most statutes mention the requirement of a president, treasurer, secretary. So those are three roles that you kind of automatically have if you are a corporation. And there's a lot that can be said about using these roles effectively, even if you're, it feels like they are not the best fit, but you're required by law to have them. How do you use an effective board president to engage the rest of the board, to make sure that agendas are really set intentionally for the rest of the board, et cetera? Is the treasurer a good interpreter of the financial aspects of the co-op for the rest of the board? Maybe the treasurer is someone with solid financial experience and can read a profit and loss statement and a balance sheet really well, but can that treasurer also usher those conversations around financial matters for the rest of the board effectively? Are you going to write that into their job description as you decide these roles? The secretary may not need to take all the notes of every single meeting, but make sure that there are good practices in place for documentation, that proper documentation and filing with the state are happening, even if it's overseeing management in doing so, that they make sure that those things have solid practices and good transparency too, right? The secretary may set up systems for documentation and transparency in a cooperative. That's something kind of unique to co-ops. And then often other roles include vice presidents or committee chairs, right? You can have standing committees, and that can be a role that you lay out in your board is having a role on a committee. Vice president can be a place where you build leadership towards a president role. So those are, in traditional boards, the most common individual roles. But some states allow for other names, such as board chairs or co-chairs, or other creative names that you might want to put on. Or maybe you're an LLC, a limited liability company, and you're not required to have these specific roles. And you can put more creative role titles that effectively communicate these roles on the board. They could be co-chairs, right? You could have a shared leadership situation. You could have a communicator that's involved in the communication practices in the board. You could have a tax matters member that is slightly different than what people associate with a treasurer. You could have an archivist, right? That may be more specific than a secretary role. So you can get creative in some circumstances. You can add additional roles than those that are required. But it's important to outline those roles and be clear about them. And the most common in many types of boards, but in co-ops as well, is that the membership elects the board in general, and then the board elects who are the officers, right? Who are these specific roles, right? Who's the president, treasurer, and secretary? That's the most common way to do it. There are other ways to do it as well, direct elections of members to elect the president, et cetera. But the most common is that the board as a group can decide who's in the best place to hold a leadership role as president, a monetary one as treasurer, and a documentation type one as secretary, et cetera. And if someone leaves, then the board is usually the one needing to replace that specific role. So that's often how it works in worker co-ops. And it's great to see the creative things out there, and feel free to share if you have other creative roles that might be of interest to other people as you set up your board. And something we mentioned a little bit before, and we'll get into, is if you don't have all of these roles in your current membership or elected board, then maybe your bylaws allow, and maybe it's a good idea to have outside board members. They're, again, usually minority, almost always the minority, or limited seats, or potentially non-voting board members, but you can fill in some of those gaps. So I think I'll pass it back to Maureen for the next activity, and we'll keep moving.
Thank you, Matt. I hope this part is useful to especially the folks in the chat like Izzy and Michelle, who say that they are trying to figure out how to make their board more effective, or they have a board, but they're still developing the practices. And for Trish, whose steering committee was falling apart, but you don't have the board yet, this activity is to frame up in your mind, based on what Matt just said, like what skills are in your team and how would those skills manifest on the board. So I'm going to put this link in the chat, and if you've used a Jamboard before, you'll be familiar. It's a place where we can virtually fill out Post-it notes together. And if you haven't used a Jamboard before and you aren't sure how to fill out a little Post-it note, Matt's going to share the Jamboard now, and you're welcome to put in the chat what you'd like to contribute. But the major question I have for you is what you think. We've gotten into a little bit of, say, the ideal skills for a treasurer, but overall, what skills does a board need? And you're welcome to come off mute. You're welcome to use the link in the chat to directly write in. And I'll be curious to see what you say based on the experiences you're bringing tonight. Well, it depends what time zone you're in. For me, it's 2 p.m.
Wait, can I pause for a moment?
Yes.
We're hearing the Spanish translation in the English channel.
I believe the thumbs up from the Spanish interpretation means that we've resolved it, but let me know. Thank you, Maddie.
Yes, it sounds great. Thank you so much.
I already see people filling this out. Ability to follow up on items in between meetings. Commitment to democracy and representing the will of members. Absolutely. I'm curious if you're writing these from a place of, I wish I had that on my board, or if this is coming from a place of genuine gratitude that you've gotten to live having that commitment and ability on your board. So if you'd like to come off mute as you're typing in the Jamboard and share why you wrote what you wrote, I'd be curious.
I wrote that. I I would say it's coming from a place of both. Sometimes having those things and sometimes not. But like a clear perception that both of those things are necessary.
Thank you for sharing that. I'm glad you've experienced it, at least in moments. And I think that's the ideal point. I want to clarify as we fill this board out together that not everyone in your co-op and not everyone on your board will come in with these skills fully realized. So it's important to consider a path for professional development for each other to make sure that you're building skills in worker owners, not only because it's one of the principles of cooperativism, but because the lack of skills on a board can become either an excuse to exclude people, like, oh, you've never been a finance guy, so we don't want you on the board because we need a finance guy. Like, what is your co-op's answer to how do people become savvy in finances? How do people learn how to read those statements Matt was referencing? And the other thing that happens when you don't consider a plan for building these skills that you're listing is that you can put someone in a position that without training, they're going to struggle to fill. And it's going to potentially contribute to conflict or tension, or it's just going to be extremely disheartening. And they might resign from the board, or they might just start to have that spill over into the other roles they take in the co-op. Because of all the ways that a worker co-op can be empowering, a board has a heavy weight, and you want people to feel that they're additionally able to take on that weight. So I did want to recognize, because these are good. Y'all have clearly used Jamboards before you're finding the post-its and no one's trying to type on each other's. Conflict engagement and emotional IQ skills is huge. Recognizing that not everyone is going to have the same vision for how to meet the members' needs. Not everyone's going to have the same vision for what the long-term strategy is, and people can get heated about their dreams. So having someone on the board who's able to mediate conflict or at least identify resources to bring in is helpful. I like seeing evaluate the CEO's performance. Some cooperatives do have CEOs. It's helpful to evaluate leadership. Culture in an organization tends to come from the top down if you have hierarchies in place, and it's helpful to identify what culture is being expressed and whether or not anyone who is in a management or a leadership role in the co-op is doing to build the health of the co-op, because that's the framework that the board thinks through. Is this going to serve us on the long term? And then I see evaluating past performance and driving strategic planning for the coming years. Yeah. And a lot of that is interpretation. And again, people can make interpretations from different places. So I'd say, because I haven't seen it yet, that you need active listening skills. Just kidding. Someone did write practice coaching skills, actively listening and asking open-ended questions, staying clear from blame or judgment. Exactly. So if someone offers something from the experience they have that they're trying to bring to the board to serve the long-term strategy and the sustainability of the co-op, and you don't agree with them, but you trust that that's where they're coming from, being able to listen is really helpful. And I would say the ability to think in systems and to place what's happening, what you're observing as a board member in context, and always keep in mind the long-term consequences of what you're seeing today. And then I see accountability, which is huge. Count on ability. I like that. Because boards may be meeting virtually, boards may be meeting infrequently, and that ability that's listed in the bottom left to follow up on items in between meetings is really important, because the board collectively determines the work they're going to do together, but often that work takes place outside of a meeting. And the last one I'd say is group decision-making skills, because at some point, after everyone's shared and everyone's actively listened, and conflict's been mediated if necessary, and you're sure in your commitment and you're sure that people are going to do what you decide to do, you have to decide what to do. And we've outlined the kinds of decisions you'll be facing in a board, but the ability to come to a group decision is really important. And there's a lot of different techniques to approach decision-making skills. And if you're interested in that specifically, we have another mini guide that can help you walk through those ideas. But it's important to recognize you're a collective and you bring a well-rounded skill set as a collective. So if you have people who are brought on for specific skills, say you have someone who everyone really trusts with the finances because prior to being in your co-op, she worked as a CPA, for example. You also want to make sure that you're asking people, is anyone interested in being trained on this, to distribute the information and the knowledge in the co-op? And you want to make sure that you aren't isolating a single skill set over another and giving it value over another, because similar to a common pay scale pattern in co-ops where you honor an hour's work with an hour's pay, a well-rounded skill set means all of the skills are interconnected, and collectively, when they are all brought onto a board, that board is successful. So you are looking for sometimes what's perceived as really specialized skills, like being able to read legal documents or being able to read financial statements. But you also want all of these skills we've listed, the broader accountability to the community, because your co-op is, according to the co-op principles and hopefully just your values as individuals in that co-op, trying to make your community better, trying to perform your work in a way that builds the broader cooperative movement. And you want people that are either good at governance or interested in getting good at governance, which means learning how to do these skills together, learning how to come to decisions, learning how to recognize when a decision can't be made yet, or when a decision can be made, and how to communicate it to the members if it's complex. So there's all this nuance to governance. And if you have more ideas and you want to come back to the Jamboard, we'll be sharing this whole slide deck later. So even though we're going to move on from this slide, your chance is not over if you get posted fever. Matt, could you go to the next one? You're gonna have to go back to the PowerPoint I realized. Thanks. So now that we've identified all the things that are beautiful and dreamy on your perfect board that you may have lived for a precious moment, we're going to talk about what to avoid. And this is crucial. And I'm curious if any of you have had experience with these things. I'd invite you again to come off mute once I've read through them. So if you don't create proper board diversity, you will feel it in every aspect of your decision making. You'll feel it in every aspect of your conversation. And diversity refers to a lot of different things. It can refer to racial and gender diversity. It can refer to how you're representing, if you have a large co-op, which workers end up on the board. So if you have a high concentration of workers who do more of the office work, and you don't have a high concentration of workers that do as much field work, the way that you perceive the strategic importance of the work is going to be influenced by that lack of diversity. We also highly caution against not using term limits. If you do not use term limits, or rather, if you have had a board without term limits, because it's not too late to change these things, putting term limits in place can avoid entrenched power. A healthy co-op is constantly building leadership, constantly sharing and distributing skills, and it's intentionally encouraging new people to step into leadership. It's intentionally saying, if you're interested in being part of these decisions, what do you need in the next 6 months, in the next year to be able to do it when it's time for a board re-election? And another thing to avoid is if the board members are the usual suspects. If there's a board election and it feels like an exercise in theater because you all know the outcome, you're doing it wrong. It shouldn't be like, oh yeah, Jenny and Javier are going to be on the board because everyone knows Jenny and Javier make all the decisions. Like, there should be an element of joy and delight in realizing people feel empowered and supported in your co-op and want to take on these roles. And the last is that special moment where founders, because of all of the work they've put into creating the co-op, sometimes believe that they hold the unique vision for what the co-op can be, and they handpick board members without having the membership give input around nominations. And as Matt showed you in the beginning, it's extremely important for members to be involved in determining who's on the board, because if it's not a one-to-one representation, if your board isn't entirely made up of all of the members of your worker co-op, you're choosing who's going to direct the path that your co-op goes down. So the last thing I'll say is if you look at your board now and you're like, oh no, you have like 30 red flags, these people have been in power for far too long, it is helpful to not just think who among us would be interested in filling those seats and who would be willing to step down, and what changes do we need to put into our bylaws maybe to facilitate those processes, but also what training could we do internally to make sure that if these feel incompatible, like if having diverse identities and viewpoints on the board feels incompatible because you really need somebody who can read the profit and loss statement, there's a few ways you can go. You can invite someone external to the board to help train them. The board can be a training space. You can also ask the person who's exiting the position to shadow and be like a board buddy. But don't panic is what I'm saying. And I'm curious, just based on how many of you are in the process of development of your board, what it's been like. Is there anything else that you've noticed you'd want to avoid? Or is there anything that you found really effective as you start building it? If you want to put it in the chat or come off mute, you're welcome. Or you could do the 1-2 punch and even come off video. Okay, y'all are staying off camera, but if you feel like sharing what you've experienced at any point, the chat's here.
I'd love to just say something. I'm going to pop in because I'm having trouble on my phone texting and typing. But I was an initial board member for the Drivers Co-op, and we had 6 people with us, and half of them we had to remove initially because everything got so contentious at our first meeting that they were questioning our manager, any financials, things that had been raised for fundraising initially to get us started, and it completely devolved. And now our steering committee is just kind of doing a little bit, not as much as we were, and trying to create a board now. So it's just been, yeah, like finding people who aren't going to be immediately distrustful and like are on board, like kind of wanting, I don't know how to do that. That's all I had, really. Just-
Sorry you lived through that, and I'm glad you shared it. I saw Matt with a flicker of recognition. Did you have anything you wanted to say back to that?
I'll just pipe in, and this is Michelle from Atow Fine Art Services, and we just had an election after a couple of years of board members being in place, and we found that there were very few people who ran for the board. So it's, you know, I think we're trying to encourage an understanding of the board's kind of roles and potentials, and like I feel like for us, it's definitely encouraging additional training and education about the potentials of what the board can do. And yeah, like a trust in the fact that it can do this work, and that we want to create a sustainable board and organization in the long run that has this circular oversight of management from the membership, and there's an active involvement. They actually hired my role, which is a kind of a unique role, I think, because the board members were too busy to get to the work. Like their day-to-day jobs were so intense that it was very hard for them to get to the work at hand. So the management team suggested my role, which is sort of an in-between. Like if you think of like what a chief of staff might be, who has a relationship to the board and the management and works on special projects, is to kind of encourage the operational aspects of the co-op.
What's your title again? I'm sorry. Your position?
Head of co-op development.
Okay.
Yeah. And it's interesting because it's like my role is definitely in that space of like trying to make sure that the board members have the authority, but I'm there to support the organizational administrative aspects of it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, cool.
Yeah. Anyway, it's a challenge also because we were so busy when we set up our board that we didn't properly do education and training about what it means to be a board member. So that's why I'm here to try to maybe create some of the educational.
That's exactly what we did. And I've just kind of taken this on myself to kind of do this and work with our incubator and try to fill this position myself, kind of, because this is what we need. We need a co-op development.
And what's your role? Are you a board member?
I'm a board member right now. Yep. And I'm
Yeah.
also trying, I mean, I'm someone who's trying to get this co-op started here. Yeah.
Yeah. Makes sense.
Yeah, there's so much that could be said about building that trust, right? As you go from steering committee to elected board.
Right. It's the trust between people who are actually workers too, because I'm actually, like, I work on the side in the same business that we're trying to do the co-op in. So I don't want to overstep things by being like, you know, a worker and a board member and on leadership and everything else. But I'm trying to figure out where my best role would be, because I don't have to do the worker part, but I'd love to empower everyone else to be able to do that more if they want to, you know.
I'm going to address Anne's question in the chat about suggestions for how long term limits could be. Just reading that out for interpretation and language justice purposes. So I don't think there's one equation or formula, you know, to figure that out. But I think it may depend on how long your terms are in general. If you have 1-year terms or 2 or 3-year terms, the limits might be a little bit different. And depending on how much turnover you have in leadership and in membership, that would impact it as well. But I would encourage you not to limit yourself too much so that you're scrambling to find the right leadership or seeing too much turnover that impacts your institutional memory and things like that. But I've often seen effective, like if you have 3-year terms, right? So they're staggered and there's some good overlap, maybe 3 terms, right? So 9 years might be an effective limit. But there's lots of ways of doing it. But I'd say that is one I've seen co-ops come into a comfortable place. And just addressing a CEO is is a manager in a cooperative, right, that is leading the operations component. And a co-op developer is usually a support organization or person that is supporting the creation and systems of a cooperative, just to define those two terms for the question that Ben put in the chat.
Maddie, do you have your hand up?
Yeah, I just wanted to chime in on the term limit piece, which is that I think that being on a board can be a really new learning experience for people, and especially if you're trying to get a population into your board that is like that's diverse, that's from all the different experiences that are affected by that are like touched by your co-op, that having a term longer than a year, I think can make a lot of sense because it gives people time to get comfortable with the materials and the rhythm and the just what a board even is. That's just my 2 cents.
Thank you, Maddie. I am really curious to move on to the interview because I'm curious to hear from another board member, Denise, about if any of this is resonating. And we will have time at the end to go back into these questions and follow up on these threads. And I'll just say that anything I've done for the first time, I've appreciated having more than a year to figure out. I'm a slow learner. So Matt, if you could advance the slide from this caution crime scene to a beautiful moment where we meet Denise Hernandez. And I'm so excited to ask you this first question because I've been curious. Could you tell us about your co-op? You're currently at your co-op and how long you've been a member.
Sure. Our organization is Cooperative Home Care Associates. We are a licensed home care agency and we're located in the Bronx. We provide home care services to the people with disabilities, people with chronic illnesses, and older adults. But we also do training. So anyone that's interested in becoming a home health aide, we have this beautiful training center on the 14th floor where they can come for 4 weeks, get trained, and get employed by CHCA. We've been operating since 1985. That's a whole lot of years. I used to say we were like the largest worker cooperative in the United States, but I think our buddies, the Drivers Co-op, are probably like catching up or past us. So we may be one of the largest co-ops. I've been working at CHCA since 2003. That's 20 years. I actually walked through the doors when our cooperative was becoming unionized. And there was a reason why I think we played nice, with the union, and we welcomed the union, and it was to build that kind of political edge and helping us get the voice out there why this work is important and get like increases. And we knew that the union kind of would help us bring that. And I just wanted to say, historically, we're at 1,600 workers right now. And historically, half of our workers are worker owners. Prior to the pandemic, we were at 2,200, but we're kind of struggling. We've lost a lot of people, and currently right now we're at 1,600. So yeah.
Wow. I'm guessing you don't have 1,600 people on your board that you've narrated.
No, actually 8 of our board members are home care workers. So us as worker owners, we nominate and we elect home care workers to sit on our board and represent us, which I think is really cool to have them helping the president lead our organization.
I think it's really cool too.
Yeah.
I'm curious, what motivated you to join the Federation board? And if you had ever been on the CHCA board before that?
So on the CHCA board, I've never ran. I've present at our CHCA board when I'm asked to. Actually, my experience working on the board has been with the Federation for the first time in my 20 years. What motivated me? I was reflecting on this question. And I'm gonna say, like, I think what motivated me is throughout the years, throughout the 20 years, we have a lot of people that contact CHCA that they want to hear. They want to hear about our worker cooperative model, how we got started, because we've been in business for so long and we've been able to sustain and be here for that long and grow. So we always opens out our doors, we do the tours, we have people come over, you know, do a nice presentation and speak about it. But I also felt like, and I remember one day I was talking to Rebecca Bowen, the director, the education and training director at Dowie. And, you know, we were talking about current struggles because the last 6-7 years have been really challenging because just business changed. And once upon a time, we used to get our clients through the health plans automatically. Now we have to go out to the community and look for clients. So that's been like a real struggle. And I remember this, like these words haunted me. Rebecca said, you cannot live in a silo by yourself. You know, you have to kind of outreach and getting involved in the co-op world. And I looked at my president and I said, you hear this? you know, I'm kind of nervous about this. But I mean, for me, I think those words kind of always like, I always had those words there. I said, and when in 2017, when the presidency changed here, Audrea Powell had a different kind of mind frame where she wanted to connect more with the different co-ops in a different way. So I think those two things and trying to get involved and get connected more and like learn more about how we can be a resource to people, but how we can also learn. Although we've been in business for so long, I think there's still a lot of learning. So yeah, that was long-winded, but I hope I answered the question. Okay.
And I'm so glad you took that leap of faith because you bring so much from such an experienced co-op to our board. And I'm curious because you did mention learning from it. Like what did you bring back from being on the Federation board to your co-op? Like what changed or what recommendations did you carry home?
So there was several things. Our board always had a financial committee. And then that was it, like a financial committee to learn, because financial statements are so complex and they wanted to take extra time to dig into those things. I think sitting on the board has allowed me to see how they run their programs through the different committees. And there's so much structure. So one of the things that I brought back was I created 2 charter committees. And I proposed them to the president. One of the charters is a policy and advocacy committee, because the last 2.5 years, we've been so involved with advocating for increases for our home care workers, and our workers have been involved with us. But I want to grow that because, you know, we have 1,600 workers, but maybe we have less than 10 that are super involved. So I created a charter for policy and advocacy committee. And then I also created a charter to elevate our services because we're struggling to get referrals, client referrals. And also there's a worker shortage in New York City. So that charter would be tasked with, we have a community ambassador program that are made up of home care workers that can go out with us to the community and talk about what role they play here as worker owners and as home care workers, and, you know, what their job looks like and how, you know, they've been committed and they've been invested in our organization and why our organization is different. So yeah, so I kind of took the charter and I said, okay, I wrote it up, you know, follow the structure that the Federation has. And so the president right now is looking at that. Another thing, do I have time to add one more? Yes. Another thing that I added was that I recommended to our president was each month we have operations meeting. We have a group of management of 14 managers and directors. And those meetings were feeling, after experiencing my experience at the board meetings, and it's not the same because these are operation meetings, but I felt like those meetings were falling short. So we're struggling, but we don't have a solid strategic plan in place. And the Federation, they have 1 month, they talk about strategy and vision. The next month, they talk about programs where we get to work with the great staff from the Federation and kind of hear what's going on and maybe problem solve or like give out suggestions and then the last month from the quarter, it's like a whole deep dive into the financial statements as a quarter review. So I was like, I went to the president and I said, what about if we use one of the meetings that we have on a bi-weekly basis to strategize? And we would use like the 2 hours just to sit there and see how we move CHCA forward. Instead of kind of hearing, where's the staffing's low here, or there's a new policy, or that's not really moving us to where we have to go. So yeah, and then we did a rotation of facilitators the way we did. I suggested to have a rotation of facilitators at those meetings, the way we do at the board meetings, to hear everybody's voice, to get everybody kind of, that it's not just one person. And we implemented simple things as check-ins because we used to go right to work. So, so those are all the fabulous stuff that I took from sitting in the board.
Oh, I'm so glad it was good to you.
Yeah.
I'm curious if any of it was challenging, like when you've been on the USFWC board, have there been types of decisions that have been challenging to make as a board member?
Yeah, I was thinking about this too. I think the most challenging decisions are always surrounded by like the financials, because I think the financials are very complex and they have like different, it's a lot, it's big. And I think they were a little intimidating. But I also think the Federation does a good job in kind of walking you through each of the pieces. But I would say, if one thing that I do find challenging and is just like, what's the impact, and you think about the members and you think about 350 members and you think about the Federation as a whole, are we making the right decision with certain financial? So I would say sometimes the finances are a bit challenging, making decisions around the finances. Yeah.
I also find those kinds of meetings challenging.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I'm curious, all those things that you brought back to your co-op, were they received like with warmth? Were people excited to try new things? Did it bring new blood?
I think sometimes when you have people and, that've been doing the business for such a long time, it's like a creature of habit. It's, they're used to. So I think some people received it well, and maybe some people are still trying to get used to it. Yeah.
I'm glad you shared that, because I think you're right. Like sometimes people just want to do what's familiar because it's what they were prepared to do.
Right.
Because they know the outcome, going into it, they know the kind of meeting it's going to be, or the kind of decision or question that's going to get asked to them.
Right. But as things around us are moving, we have to move too. And I think, sometimes some people struggle with that. Yeah. Yeah.
My last question for you, but you're welcome to keep sharing because you have so much to share. What kinds of decisions have you enjoyed making as a board member?
So for the last several months up to like the Federation, we did a retreat, and the retreat was focused on like revisiting the Federation's mission, vision, values, the theory of change. I think for me, that's what I've gotten most excited about working, being able to change something that's gonna impact like and how we sell ourselves, how do the members benefit, what's the impact on the members, seeing it from like kind of where we started to like the end. And that's like continuity, like we would start one place and then we would come back where we left off. And, in the retreat, we got to see like the last draft of all these things that we worked on, and they're going to be presented to the members. But participating in that was something that I really enjoyed. I'm also a little bit of a nerd, so I like to look at the policies when policies are presented, or like MOUs, memorandum of understanding. So we have an opportunity to read it and provide feedback and then vote on it. Those I like. And I think one last thing would be like the engagement form that the membership committee created to get like feedback from the members on governance proposals, policies, feedback, concerns that they may have. That we saw that from, again, from like the beginning of where we started to edit and look at it, to this last member meeting where it was presented, and hopefully our members will begin to use it. So yeah, those are the kind of decisions that I like to participate in.
I'm glad to hear that, and I'm glad to learn you're a nerd. I'm a nerd too. And
Yes. Yeah.
if
Yeah.
anyone on this call is considering being a member of the Federation, you can give that feedback that on that form that Denise mentioned, because we are an organization that is 100% member led, and we have 100% member elected board of directors, and all of the directors on our board are worker owners. So it's a unique multi-level thing to be in a federation where you have worker owners working inside their own co-ops to build boards, and then leaving their co-ops to contribute, like Denise was willing to do, to the strength of the movement overall. Is there anything else you want to share?
Yeah, no, I was just kind of reflecting and like thinking about this and this webinar. And I think what the Federation does so well is because the staff is really good at presenting what's going on and having those dialogues. And then the board members that we have, there's members that are very direct, and like if something, maybe there's another way of looking at it, or like maybe they have a different perspective, they say it. And I think the Federation does a good job in creating that trust and in those meetings where people don't feel like, you have to agree. There's different voices and there's different perspectives, and those different perspectives are welcomed in the group. I think the Federation does that really well, where you don't feel like intimidated, or should I say it or should I not say it? They kind of welcome it and discuss it. So yeah.
I'm so glad. I don't spend a lot of time in board meetings, but every time I've gone, I've been so impressed with like what you said, the structure and the openness. Hi, Melissa, I see you signing off in the chat. You can get the recording after if anyone else has to leave early. And Denise, I'm so glad that you were willing to be interviewed for this conversation. I had long been curious what it's like to be in a co-op and then try to represent the whole movement and the direction of the whole movement in the Federation. That's no small task. Like when we talk about that strategic vision and kind of the burden of being on the board, going all the way up to like the board of the Federation of all the co-ops in the country is a lot of work. So thank you for your board service.
Thank you.
We're going to move to questions and answers. And Denise, you are considered an expert on this call, so you're welcome to answer any of the questions too. And I'll pass it to Matt. Thank you again. If anyone has questions and they want to come off mute, you can. If you want to bring something up that you brought up earlier, we have the time for that. And if you want to just put it in the chat, you can do that too.
I just want to say this has been very, very informative. Happy to, I think we kind of fell apart because we didn't have any initial training to begin with. So I'm just trying to do as much training as I can now. And this is really, really good training. So thank you. That's all.
I'm so glad that it's useful. We always welcome if you have something going on in your co-op that just feels like you're stuck in the mud. Let us know, because I can almost guarantee that another co-op is experiencing it, and the co-op clinic is constantly trying to create tools and resources to just help us all figure it out together. And the other thing I'll say is when people fall apart, like when anything falls apart in an organization, but especially a co-op, because there's that perception and intention that it's going to be better than a different workplace. There's a little bit of like just holding the emotional experience y'all had together, and acknowledging like this was disappointing and this was hard and maybe everyone resigned, but like could there be exit interviews, or just kind of even if people have such hard feelings that they don't want to put their name on it, like anonymous feedback about what could have worked better, or like where their skepticism was coming from. Where was that worry about how the finances are being spent coming from? So the more surveys and the more interaction, the better, just to learn, because like you are gonna trip on the way. And I see Izzy's hand up. Go ahead.
I had a couple questions. Can you think of some ways to like, or maybe just talk about some ways that you've seen to like make sure that board members have the time to execute on their kind of board duties in addition to their normal working responsibilities? And then also, what are some, like, do you know of any like kind of specific training techniques or materials or anything to ensure that people have the kind of like I'm not sure the best word for it, but kind of like a feeling of leadership or the feeling to be able to kind of assert decision-making power as a board member? Because like I think a lot of people aren't used to, if you're just like in a regular employee at a company, like you don't ever have that, right? So a lot of people aren't really used to asserting themselves in that way. So I'm curious, yeah, to hear what you have to say about those two topics.
I'm going to kick it to Matt for the first one while I think about the answer to the second one. Those are great questions.
Yeah. I don't know if there's any great ways beyond compensation or thinking strategically about people's work responsibilities and balancing that with board responsibilities, you know, but you know, compensation for board involvement looks very different for different co-ops too. So you can be compensated, there can be a stipend, right? That's just a across the board stipend for board involvement. Or some co-ops, you know, do include you know, hours worked on co-op boards as paid hours. And so then balancing the time, you know, if someone's in a high responsibility role on the board, compensating their work plans, you know, as you go forward, I guess is one solution I've seen work in a few occasions, but usually that's pretty tricky, right? They may be in a leadership role, you know, in the co-op on the operation side, and then they take on additional role in the governance side. So additional compensation might be one component, but beyond that, I'm not sure if there's any great solutions. I'd love to hear if other people have additional solutions around that. Yeah. And I just want to share, maybe Maureen has more on the second question, but yeah, really solid onboarding policies, you know, practices for new board members or board members, you know, before they even, you know, are board members, knowing, you know, what the role of the board is, knowing some of the things we went over in terms of decision-making roles, having a really clear decision-making chart, right? What decision goes where, who makes what kind of thing, can be an empowering thing for members to step up into those leadership roles. And that we have a lot of great trainers in our peer advisor network to do that kind of work as well. Our peer advisors are people who have been in co-ops, who have been in boards of co-ops, who are now trainers and do a lot of the training and facilitation and technical assistance work on setting up those policies and helping you find the right kind of starting place for templates in board education and onboarding and development.
There's a question in the chat specifically for Denise, so I'm going to read that out loud and then I'll come back to Izzy's question. The question for Denise is, how does your co-op elect its board members? If you vote, what percentage of the members turn out for the vote, and what method is used to hold the election?
No. Thank you, Ben. So every year, we have 8 home care workers. Every year we have to, and they serve a 2-year term. So every year, we have to vote on 4 are coming off, and we have to vote 4 more new members. And the other question was, let me see if you will. Okay, so this is the interesting part, right? We have to have like 50% of our worker owners vote. During that pandemic, we're so used to doing everything like manually here. Prior to the pandemic, what we used to do is have the workers come on site and vote here. During the pandemic, we got like creative, and we had people do YouTube videos of their statements, and we sent out the voting form through the emails and through text. And that's how we communicate with our workers through the pandemic. And we noticed that when we did that, we had a lot more people voting. There were still like reminders that we had to set out because we wanted to hit like the 51%. But we noticed that when we did it electronically, guess what? More people showed up, and more people cast their votes instead of coming on here on site and having to do this like for a whole month, like every Friday, having people resources in the front. So I think our best solution here was the YouTube videos of having people make their statements as to why they're interested in running, and then sending out texting like the voting form and receiving that back was our best method so far. And we got the response that we needed.
Thank you for your question, Ben, and thank you for your answer, Denise. I've been reflecting on Izzy's question about how people can feel empowered to participate. And I do think Denise's answer is connected. It's like, you meet people where they're at. So for people who don't necessarily feel comfortable just speaking off the cuff, what Matt shared earlier about sharing what types of decisions are going to be discussed in the meeting lets people come in prepared. You know, they can bring something written down. They can just generally like feel informed enough to be present in the meeting, enough to have an opinion in the meeting, because not everyone is just ready to like rapidly go into brainstorm mode. And there's a few tools from something called Sociocracy that I think are really helpful to just build a culture of participation. And if you haven't heard of Sociocracy before, it's a management structure that has circles or committees around specific work areas. And then there's a general circle with representatives from the smaller circles for dealing with like the overall picture of the co-op and anything that would involve the little circles interconnecting. Ooh, double shout out to Sociocracy. Yes, I'm glad these ideas are out here. So something that I've observed in Sociocracy is the practice of everyone doing a round of participating. And so when you set that as a norm, which is to say the equivalent on this call would be I'd share, and then whoever's Zoom box is below me would share, and whoever's Zoom box is below them would share. You just practice saying something every time, and it normalizes participation. You know when you're going to be asked because it's in a rotation that's very like visually readable, you know, that you see, okay, that person spoke, so I'm up next. And it just makes it so that you realize over time, on some topics, I have stronger opinions than others. And sometimes you can just reflect back what you've heard and not necessarily have to have a new idea. But the expectation of speaking helps because then it doesn't come down to the people who are most confident in their idea or the people who are most comfortable talking. And the other thing I'll say that I've learned from Sociocracy is if you notice that there's people who are consistently not participating potentially because it's a large group, people enjoy smaller spaces sometimes. A Zoom pattern I've noticed a lot is that everyone's off camera until we go into tiny breakout rooms. And then they're on camera and they're a lot more active. And I think there's a fair amount of people who like to discuss something with 2 or 3 other people before they bring it to 10 other people or 16 other people. So it's possible too to have spaces of varied sizes to encourage participation, to say like to, you know, turn to your neighbor and talk through this, and then one of you two can present back, so that people are still speaking, but they don't necessarily have to be speaking to the full room till they're ready and comfortable in that role. And then the last thing, I really have been inspired by sociocracy. The last thing I'll say is just having a predictable meeting format, as much as it is also extremely valuable to spice it up like Denise is doing in CHCA. In the beginning, when people are new to a board, knowing, okay, we're going to be presented with information. There's a really clear process where we're going to have time to ask questions. We're going to have time to understand specifically what's the goal of today. And then coming into that space and knowing every time, okay, for about 10 minutes, I'm just listening. And for about 5 minutes, I'm trying to figure out what people's questions are, or if I have any of my own. And then there comes a part where I have to share. People respond to structure sometimes, and then there's other people who do not. So, you know, everyone's reason for being quiet in a meeting is different. But the last thing I'll say is really that there's alternate ways to engage. I do think a skill long-term to be on a board is to be able to be in a group conversation. But in the beginning, you could ask everyone to prepare, you know, like 3 to 4 sentences and send them in advance. And then you just read them in the beginning of the meeting instead of everyone going around and talking. So you can just implement a lot of different tools to see if any of them work. And also it's really worth having a support system for new board members, whether that's a board buddy of someone who used to be on the board, or it's someone that they just have a trusting relationship with in their co-op, so that you can just directly ask, like, what's keeping you from speaking up? And then work from there. Like, what would make this meeting more inviting? Do you need more information? Are you in conflict with someone in the room? Is someone here outside of this space your manager, whatever? Just try to find the root cause of why they're not speaking, and find out if they're motivated by the project of the board and they have things to share, and there's just an obstacle to sharing them. Does anyone else have any questions? And Izzy, let me know if any of that was helpful. Any other questions? You can put them in the chat. Ooh, okay. Izzy, I see you raise your hand. Go ahead.
Yeah, that was helpful. I just wanted to kind of ask something a little slightly more specific, in case you might have something to add. So, I guess specifically what I'm wondering is, like, in the interaction between board members and management, how to help people feel empowered in that interaction. You know what I mean?
Do you mean because they would perceive it's not their place to tell management what to do?
Yeah, I think that sense is a lot of people have that feeling. You know, it's instilled in people, generally in normal organizations, and like especially in ours, which transitioned to being a cooperative. I think there's still that residual. So.
I see Matt's thinking face. Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I've just seen co-ops that have the dynamic often of, like, in the field workers who are then, board members and overseeing management who's in an office. That dynamic is a really tough one to overcome, like you're mentioning. And I think clarity around and retraining and re-onboarding, around the distinction, like, I've already mentioned it, but the distinction between governance and operations can be useful to just be like, we're not meddling in management's oversight of these components, but it is our job to oversee these components, and then training up on finances and things like that in order to be able to really have a real say. Yeah, I think you're right. We're often, told this is our role. If we have this role on the shop floor, that is a place we're comfortable in the general organization, but then it changes once we're on a board and have a more of an oversight in that arena. So yeah, what other kinds of empowerment activities? I think experience seeing other worker owners, you know, have strong opinions in that boardroom setting, doing trainings that make people comfortable in making financial and management oversight and evaluation type work. But yeah, those are, it's hard to invest a lot of time in addition to the role of just being on the board and making those decisions, but it's usually worthwhile in the long run.
Denise, go ahead.
Yeah, what made me kind of reflect is for like CHCA, when we do a board orientation for the new members going on, we do this activity where we have kind of like a spreadsheet, and we list out a bunch of duties and responsibilities, like who sets policies, who's responsible for creating the budget, who's involved in the collective bargaining agreement. Then we have like columns where it says management, board members, worker owners, 1199. And we go through that, and it's a lot more other stuff that we have there, but we go through that and we ask like the workers, who do they think, you know, makes the overall responsibility? Who do they have to, who do we inform? So we go through that exercise just to hear like where they're at. And, you know, if they're correct, great. If not, then we explain, no, you know, the union doesn't have any say in this. The union is connected to when we do collective bargaining, or this is a management decision, like to set up an internal policy. So, I mean, just thinking back to Matt saying like retraining, that's, you know, yeah, I wanted to share that that's an activity that we do here just to help people get more clarity.
Thank you, Denise. And I have one point, which is what Matt mentioned around the shop floor versus management feeling. There's something about home court advantage. So if you're having the board meeting in a space that management feels most comfortable in, it might make workers feel less comfortable in that space. So it's possible to have the meetings, if they're in person, take place in a place where people feel empowered because it's their, you know, it's like they're part of the work. If it's a manufacturing plant, it's the place that they work, and you just put a circle of chairs. Sometimes just the ambiance of the room, like people can feel very intimidated by like a big meeting table corporate style. So depending on how you're meeting, if it's a physical meeting, people can just like subconsciously feel out of place, and then they feel even further out of place speaking. I think we have on our usworker.coop/clinic page, we have a place that you can request support if you want to have any of these conversations to try to identify like more root causes in your co-op. You can request an intake with me and Matt, and we'll just spend 30 minutes sussing out what might be the next step for you. That is available to everyone, and that 30 minutes is free. And I wanted to pass it to Matt to share some other resources we've developed as the clinic.
Yeah, so there are two mini guides that are very relevant to the topics we touched on today. One is about building your worker co-op board. So if you're in, I noticed a few of you are in that phase of going from steering committee to board. How do you make that transition? What are some of the best practices? What are some of the mistakes that other co-ops have dealt with? We've tried to compile that down to, these are the specific, you know, things for worker co-ops, and these are the resources to look at. There's so many great resources on our partners website, Democracy at Work Institute, at institute.coop, but sometimes it's hard to find the right resource for where you're at. So these guides are aimed to guide you through the major considerations and questions, and then the resources that would be most helpful for that stage that you're at. The next one is effective worker co-op boards, which a lot of the content we went over today is there, but written out with additional resources. So samples of those matrices that that Denise just mentioned about who decides what, and you know, so there's great examples of those in these mini guides, template documents, and lots of other considerations we couldn't fit in here today. And then I also mentioned earlier those ICA group resources around the significance and extensiveness tests and other tests and other board best practices that ICA group has. So those are linked here when we'll be sending out these slides, and you can find those resources at ICA group's website. And there's so many more out there too. But hopefully these guides are a good place. And there are other guides too around decision making that might be effective, or onboarding, because what we talked about today in terms of onboarding board members is key, but also a step before that, doing effective member onboarding. So that's all there as well. Pass it back to Maureen for the last little bit.
Thank you. That was a good transition, because the next upcoming event is a worker co-op startup webinar, which we do once a month in English, to give people like that basic context of what does it mean to be a worker owner. And sometimes when people are struggling with that question, it's hard to add the additional question of what does it mean to be on a board. So that webinar is key steps to getting your co-op off the ground, and a guide to where problems often occur, and some introductory formats to navigating them. And it's also helpful to know we have that quarterly in Spanish, and sometimes that call specifically has a space for supporting conversations that immigrant co-ops who speak Spanish want to get into on a more complex level. So that's monthly in English, and then once a quarter in Spanish. And the next upcoming event, Denise mentioned engaging worker owners in policy and advocacy. And if you're interested in doing that in your co-op and you want to come to the Federation and learn more about what that looks like on the local level, the state level, the federal level, this is one of our member councils. So it is a members only space. And it's a place to meet and learn and try to find consensus around what are the worker-centered values that we want to push through in legislation. And we will be sharing the recording, and we'll be sending out these slides, so you'll have access to the links. The Worker Co-op Policy Pulse is a place to get updates. It's essentially like what has come out of that policy and advocacy work call. That one's quarterly. It's bilingual in English and Spanish, and you can just hear what we're doing as a federation on behalf of members. So it's our accountability to that process, and making sure that the policies that we're advocating for are actually going to change the material lives of the worker owners who will be affected by them. And then the last one, if you feel like being in another space, and all these spaces are spaces you can explore to see if you're interested in bringing some of that home, or representing something that's going really well and bringing that knowledge from your co-op to the bigger community, is the Holding Change peer network. And this one is a space that's more directed towards facilitators and educators to support democratic workplaces and worker co-ops. So if you're a member of the Federation, if you're a worker co-op or a democratic workplace that does any facilitation or consulting, or you're a business that offers facilitation or consulting to worker co-ops or democratic workplaces, this is a place to go. And if you have worked with an incubator or a co-op developer that you think could bear to learn some skills about working with co-ops, this is also a place to refer them to see some of the brightest minds in our network working on how to create change in our movement. So I want to make sure, Izzy, you saw there's a response to your question in the chat. We are going to stop the recording and email it out to all of y'all. And in the future, if you think I would love to sit through an hour and a half on another topic, let us know. Our webinars are here to serve, and it's been really nice to meet all of you and just hear like the diversity of experiences and the commonalities. And I hope this was useful.